Part 2, The Bluebird and the Big Machine, 2004-2008. Chapter 11. The Hendersonville Relocation. The girl arrived early. That was the first thing anyone noticed. While the other performers milled outside the Bluebird Cafe on a warm Nashville evening in 2005, trading cigarettes and practiced nonchalance in the parking lot off Hill Center Road, Taylor Allison Swift was already inside, perched at a small round table near the back, running her thumb along the fret of her guitar like she was reading Braille. She was 15 years old. She had driven here, or rather been driven here, by her mother Andrea, who waited somewhere nearby with the particular patience of a woman who had already reorganized her entire life around a daughter's certainty, to perform in an open mic-style showcase before an audience that included, though she could not yet know it, the man who would remake the architecture of her future. She ordered nothing. She watched everything. The Bluebird Cafe, for those who have never pressed through its modest glass door, is not what the mythology suggests. It seats 90 people, perhaps fewer when the guitars come out. It smells of spilled beer and old wood, and something harder to name, the specific perfume of ambition that has been concentrated in a small room for decades. It was here that Kathy Mattea was discovered. Here that Garth Brooks was heard. The room had a grammar of its own. No talking during the songs, no exceptions. A hush enforced not by any bouncer, but by the collective understanding that something might happen at any moment. And no one wanted to be the person who missed it because they were chattering about their weekend. Taylor Swift understood this grammar instinctively. She had been studying it, in one form or another, since she was 10 years old, and standing on a community theater stage in Wyomissing, Pennsylvania, performing in productions of Annie and Grease and Bye Bye Birdie, with a ferocity that her drama coaches would later describe, with fond bewilderment, as excessive for the venue. Musical theater had given her the essential tool she would spend the rest of her life refining: the ability to make a room feel that a song was being performed exclusively for each individual person sitting in it. At 15, this gift was raw but unmistakable, the way certain athletes move as children with a fluency that makes grown men stop and point. The cultural terrain she was navigating in 2005 was not hospitable to what she wanted to be. Country music, in that particular moment, was engaged in one of its periodic identity crises. The genre had spent the late 1990s and early 2000s riding the extraordinary commercial wave of artists like Shania Twain and Faith Hill, women who had proved that country could conquer pop radio without fully surrendering its twang and heartache soul. But by 2005, the industry's conventional wisdom had calcified into a formula that left little room for a teenage girl writing her own songs about high school hallways and complicated boys. Nashville signed women in their 20s and 30s. Nashville did not sign 15-year-olds. Nashville, more to the point, did not sign 15-year-olds and then hand them creative control over their own material. The very idea would have produced, in any standard A&R meeting of that era, the kind of polite, killing laughter that passes for institutional wisdom. Taylor had already learned this the hard way. She had arrived in Nashville 2 years earlier at 13, armed with a demo tape of karaoke covers that her mother helped her produce, and had walked it personally to every major label on Music Row. She had gotten meetings. She had charmed the rooms. She was constitutionally incapable of not charming a room, and then she had received, in various phrasings that all meant the same thing, the same answer. Come back when you're older. Come back when you've grown into something we already know how to sell. Come back, in other words, when you are no longer yourself. Andrea Swift, who had left a career in marketing to drive her daughter to Nashville, and then eventually to relocate the entire family there, watched these rejections with the controlled expression of a woman filing information for later use. Taylor's father, Scott Swift, a financial advisor with Merrill Lynch, had arranged a transfer to the company's Nashville office. The family had purchased a house in Hendersonville, a suburb north of the city, and enrolled Taylor and her younger brother Austin in new schools. The move was total and irrevocable, and it had been made on the strength of a teenager's conviction. If that conviction turned out to be misplaced, there was no graceful retreat available. Taylor responded to the label rejections not with despair, but with the particular stubbornness that would become, over the following 2 decades, both her most valuable professional asset and the source of her most operatic conflicts. She enrolled at a music business program at a local college, studying the industry she intended to conquer. She co-wrote songs with professional Nashville songwriters, sitting across from men and women twice her age, who arrived expecting to carry the creative weight of the session, and discovered with varying degrees of surprise that the teenager with the legal pad already had 3 verses and a hook waiting. Liz Rose, a veteran songwriter who would become one of her most important collaborators, later recalled the experience of writing with a 14-year-old Taylor as uncanny. Not because Taylor was precocious in the way the word is usually meant, as a charming mimicry of adult sophistication, but because her instincts about emotional truth in a lyric were simply correct, with a consistency that could not be explained by experience she hadn't yet had. This was the core of what Taylor Swift was, at 15, before the machinery of celebrity had any purchase on her. She was a songwriter first. Not a singer who also wrote. Not a performer who dabbled in composition. The songs were primary. Everything else, the voice, the stage presence, the relentless work ethic that had her writing or co-writing more than a dozen songs before she had a single record deal, existed in service of the songs. She kept a notebook. She always kept a notebook. She wrote about what had actually happened to her, which in a 15-year-old's life meant the specific social catastrophes of high school, the friends who turned, the boys who looked through her, the particular cruelty of being smart and strange and intensely feeling in an environment that rewards comfortable averageness. These were not, on their surface, the subjects of great art. They became great art because she refused to generalize them. Every name in every song was real. Every detail was specific. The specificity was the whole point. Scott Borchetta had spent enough years in the music industry to have developed a finely calibrated sense of when a room's attention shifted. He had worked at Universal Music Group's DreamWorks Nashville imprint, learning the business of discovery from the inside, and he was now in the earliest stages of planning something audacious. His own record label, which he intended to name Big Machine Records, a venture so independently financed and conceptually unfashionable in the era of major label consolidation that his colleagues had greeted the idea with the particular silence of people who are trying to decide whether to be impressed or concerned. He was at the Bluebird that evening, for reasons of general industry reconnaissance, when Taylor Swift began to play. What happened next has been reconstructed from multiple accounts, and the details vary slightly depending on who is telling it and when, but the essential fact is consistent. Borchetta went still. He had seen thousands of performances in thousands of rooms, and he had learned to trust the specific quality of his own attention when it snagged on something, the way a sleeve catches on a nail. He listened to her original songs, not covers, original material, which was itself unusual enough for a teenager that it recalibrated his expectations mid-performance. And he heard not just the songs, but the songwriter inside them, someone who understood, with a sophistication that had nothing to do with age, that the best country songs are not about feelings in the abstract, but about the exact moment when a specific feeling changed everything. After her set, he approached her. The conversation, by all accounts, was brief and careful on both sides. Borchetta was not yet in a position to sign anyone. Big Machine did not yet formally exist. Taylor was not in a position to sign carelessly. But something was established in that conversation that would prove more durable than a contract, a mutual recognition. He saw what she was. She, with the antenna she had been developing since childhood for the precise tenor of adult interest, understood that he was seeing it correctly. The partnership that emerged from this encounter was, by the standards of the music industry, extraordinary. Borchetta offered Taylor Swift something that no major label had been willing to consider: creative control. She would co-write every song on her debut album. She would have meaningful input into her artistic direction. She would not be handed a producer's vision of what a teenage girl should sound like and told to inhabit it. In exchange, she would build something with him that neither of them could fully see yet, from a label with no roster, no infrastructure, and no particular reason to succeed except the specific conviction of two people who both had things to prove. Andrea Swift, who had by this point become not merely a supportive mother, but something closer to a strategic partner in her daughter's career, assessed the offer with the same unsentimental clarity she had applied to the Nashville rejections. The major labels had the resources and the reach. Big Machine had the terms. The terms mattered more. Taylor agreed. She was 15 years old when she signed. The ink dried on an arrangement that would make her, within 3 years, one of the most commercially successful artists in the history of Nashville, and would set in motion a legal and financial entanglement over the ownership of her recordings that would, more than a decade later, play out as one of the most dramatic and public disputes in the modern music industry. None of that was visible yet. What was visible, in the fall of 2005, was a girl with a notebook full of songs, a label that had not yet released a single record, and a mother who had moved her family across a state line on the strength of a teenager's conviction that she was meant to do something specific with her life. The debut album came in 2006, after months of recording sessions at Bluebird Studio in Nashville, where Taylor arrived every day with the focused seriousness of someone who understood that the session was being paid for and that time in a professional studio was not to be wasted on feeling out the room. She wrote or co-wrote every track. The lead single, Tim McGraw, was a song she had composed in a math class at Hendersonville High School, tapping out the melody in her head while the lesson moved around her, constructing in real time a lyric that was ostensibly about a boy she was dating, but was actually, with the characteristic double vision of her best work, about the nature of memory itself, about how a song becomes the vessel for a feeling that would otherwise evaporate. She was a junior in high school when it reached number 40 on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart. The album that followed, self-titled, spare, bracingly direct, was received with the warmth that the industry reserves for pleasant surprises, which is a lesser warmth than the kind reserved for anticipated triumphs, but sufficient warmth to justify a second record. Taylor Swift, the album, eventually sold more than 5 million copies in the United States. At the time of its release, she was 16 years old and still doing homework in the back of a tour bus. What the sales figures could not capture was the quality of the audience the album assembled. Taylor Swift did not simply find listeners. She found people, overwhelmingly young women, overwhelmingly in the process of navigating the same treacherous social terrain she was writing about, who experienced her songs not as entertainment but as articulation. The distinction matters. Entertainment is enjoyed and set aside. Articulation is held onto. It names something that has been felt but not said, and in the naming, it creates a bond between the articulator and the articulated, for that is categorically different from the bond of ordinary fandom. The girls who bought Taylor Swift's debut album felt, with a conviction that did not require examination, that she understood them. She did understand them. She was them, or had been them recently enough that the understanding was not manufactured. Fearless, the second album, arrived in November 2008, and it was a different kind of event entirely. Louder, more assured, more deliberately aimed at a crossover audience that country radio had not yet learned it was supposed to resist. It would win the Grammy Award for Album of the Year, making Taylor Swift, at 19, the youngest artist in history to receive the honor. The music industry, which had spent years teaching her the sophisticated language of rejection, was about to discover that she had been listening very carefully and had been taking excellent notes, and that she had quietly built something in the meantime that no one had quite seen coming, except perhaps for the specific woman who had been there at the beginning, waiting in a parking lot in Nashville while her daughter sat alone in a room full of strangers watching everything. But no one understood yet, not Borchetta, not Andrea, not the industry analysts, who were already beginning to construct the narrative of the girl from Pennsylvania who conquered Nashville, was that the very terms of the deal signed in 2005, the terms that had seemed, in that hopeful moment of mutual recognition, like the foundation of something rare and reciprocal, were quietly accumulating the weight of a future argument that neither party was yet equipped to have. Chapter 12. The Bluebird Cafe Showcase. The girl arrived early. That was the first thing anyone noticed. While the other performers milled outside the Bluebird Cafe on a warm Nashville evening in 2005, trading cigarettes and practiced nonchalance in the parking lot off Hill Center Road, Taylor Allison Swift was already inside, perched at a small round table near the back, running her thumb along the fret of her guitar like she was reading Braille. She was 15 years old. She had driven here, or rather been driven here, by her mother Andrea, who waited somewhere nearby with the particular patience of a woman who had already reorganized her entire life around a daughter's certainty, to perform in an open mic-style showcase before an audience that included, though she could not yet know it, the man who would remake the architecture of her future. She ordered nothing. She watched everything. The Bluebird Cafe, for those who have never pressed through its modest glass door, is not what the mythology suggests. It seats 90 people, perhaps fewer when the guitars come out. It smells of spilled beer and old wood, and something harder to name, the specific perfume of ambition that has been concentrated in a small room for decades. It was here that Kathy Mattea was discovered. Here that Garth Brooks was heard. The room had a grammar of its own. No talking during the songs, no exceptions. A hush enforced not by any bouncer, but by the collective understanding that something might happen at any moment. And no one wanted to be the person who missed it because they were chattering about their weekend. Taylor Swift understood this grammar instinctively. She had been studying it, in one form or another, since she was 10 years old, and standing on a community theater stage in Wyomissing, Pennsylvania, performing in productions of Annie in Greece and Bye Bye Birdie, with a ferocity that her drama coaches would later describe with fond bewilderment as excessive for the venue. Musical theater had given her the essential tool she would spend the rest of her life refining: the ability to make a room feel that a song was being performed exclusively for each individual person sitting in it. At 15, this gift was raw but unmistakable, the way certain athletes move as children with a fluency that makes grown men stop and point. The cultural terrain she was navigating in 2005 was not hospitable to what she wanted to be. Country music, in that particular moment, was engaged in one of its periodic identity crises. The genre had spent the late 1990s and early 2000s riding the extraordinary commercial wave of artists like Shania Twain and Faith Hill, women who had proved that country could conquer pop radio without fully surrendering its twang and heartache soul. But by 2005, the industry's conventional wisdom had calcified into a formula that left little room for a teenage girl writing her own songs about high school hallways and complicated boys. Nashville signed women in their 20s and 30s. Nashville did not sign 15-year-olds. Nashville, more to the point, did not sign 15-year-olds and then hand them creative control over their own material. The very idea would have produced, in any standard A&R meeting of that era, the kind of polite, killing laughter that passes for institutional wisdom. Taylor had already learned this the hard way. She had arrived in Nashville 2 years earlier at 13, armed with a demo tape of karaoke covers that her mother helped her produce, and had walked it personally to every major label on Music Row. She had gotten meetings. She had charmed the rooms. She was constitutionally incapable of not charming a room, and then she had received in various phrasings that all meant the same thing, the same answer. Come back when you're older. Come back when you've grown into something we already know how to sell. Come back, in other words, when you are no longer yourself. Andrea Swift, who had left a career in marketing to drive her daughter to Nashville, and then eventually to relocate the entire family there, watched these rejections with the controlled expression of a woman filing information for later use. Taylor's father, Scott Swift, a financial advisor with Merrill Lynch, had arranged a transfer to the company's Nashville office. The family had purchased a house in Hendersonville, a suburb north of the city, and enrolled Taylor and her younger brother Austin in new schools. The move was total and irrevocable, and it had been made on the strength of a teenager's conviction. If that conviction turned out to be misplaced, there was no graceful retreat available. Taylor responded to the label rejections not with despair, but with the particular stubbornness that would become, over the following 2 decades, both her most valuable professional asset and the source of her most operatic conflicts. She enrolled at a music business program at a local college, studying the industry she intended to conquer. She co-wrote songs with professional Nashville songwriters, sitting across from men and women twice her age, who arrived expecting to carry the creative weight of the session, and discovered with varying degrees of surprise that the teenager with the legal pad already had 3 verses and a hook waiting. Liz Rose, a veteran songwriter who would become one of her most important collaborators, later recalled the experience of writing with a 14-year-old Taylor as uncanny. Not because Taylor was precocious in the way the word is usually meant, as a charming mimicry of adult sophistication, but because her instincts about emotional truth in a lyric were simply correct, with a consistency that could not be explained by experience she hadn't yet had. This was the core of what Taylor Swift was, at 15, before the machinery of celebrity had any purchase on her. She was a songwriter first. Not a singer who also wrote. Not a performer who dabbled in composition. The songs were primary. Everything else, the voice, the stage presence, the relentless work ethic that had her writing or co-writing more than a dozen songs before she had a single record deal, existed in service of the songs. She kept a notebook. She always kept a notebook. She wrote about what had actually happened to her, which in a 15-year-old's life meant the specific social catastrophes of high school, the friends who turned, the boys who looked through her, the particular cruelty of being smart and strange and intensely feeling in an environment that rewards comfortable averageness. These were not, on their surface, the subjects of great art. They became great art because she refused to generalize them. Every name in every song was real. Every detail was specific. The specificity was the whole point. Scott Borchetta had spent enough years in the music industry to have developed a finely calibrated sense of when a room's attention shifted. He had worked at Universal Music Group's DreamWorks Nashville imprint, learning the business of discovery from the inside, and he was now in the earliest stages of planning something audacious. His own record label, which he intended to name Big Machine Records, a venture so independently financed and conceptually unfashionable in the era of major label consolidation that his colleagues had greeted the idea with the particular silence of people who are trying to decide whether to be impressed or concerned. He was at the Bluebird that evening, for reasons of general industry reconnaissance, when Taylor Swift began to play. What happened next has been reconstructed from multiple accounts, and the details vary slightly depending on who is telling it and when, but the essential fact is consistent: Borchetta went still. He had seen thousands of performances in thousands of rooms, and he had learned to trust the specific quality of his own attention when it snagged on something the way a sleeve catches on a nail. He listened to her original songs, not covers, original material, which was itself unusual enough for a teenager that it recalibrated his expectations mid-performance. And he heard not just the songs, but the songwriter inside them, someone who understood, with a sophistication that had nothing to do with age, that the best country songs are not about feelings in the abstract, but about the exact moment when a specific feeling changed everything. After her set, he approached her. The conversation, by all accounts, was brief and careful on both sides. Borchetta was not yet in a position to sign anyone. Big Machine did not yet formally exist. Taylor was not in a position to sign carelessly. But something was established in that conversation that would prove more durable than a contract, a mutual recognition. He saw what she was. She, with the antenna she had been developing since childhood for the precise tenor of adult interest, understood that he was seeing it correctly. The partnership that emerged from this encounter was, by the standards of the music industry, extraordinary. Borchetta offered Taylor Swift something that no major label had been willing to consider: creative control. She would co-write every song on her debut album. She would have meaningful input into her artistic direction. She would not be handed a producer's vision of what a teenage girl should sound like and told to inhabit it. In exchange, she would build something with him that neither of them could fully see yet, from a label with no roster, no infrastructure, and no particular reason to succeed except the specific conviction of two people who both had things to prove. Andrea Swift, who had by this point become not merely a supportive mother, but something closer to a strategic partner in her daughter's career, assessed the offer with the same unsentimental clarity she had applied to the Nashville rejections. The major labels had the resources and the reach. Big Machine had the terms. The terms mattered more. Taylor agreed. She was 15 years old when she signed. The ink dried on an arrangement that would make her, within 3 years, one of the most commercially successful artists in the history of Nashville, and would set in motion a legal and financial entanglement over the ownership of her recordings that would, more than a decade later, play out as one of the most dramatic and public disputes in the modern music industry. None of that was visible yet. What was visible, in the fall of 2005, was a girl with a notebook full of songs, a label that had not yet released a single record, and a mother who had moved her family across a state line on the strength of a teenager's conviction that she was meant to do something specific with her life. The debut album came in 2006, after months of recording sessions at Bluebird Studio in Nashville, where Taylor arrived every day with the focused seriousness of someone who understood that the session was being paid for and that time in a professional studio was not to be wasted on feeling out the room. She wrote or co-wrote every track. The lead single, Tim McGraw, was a song she had composed in a math class at Hendersonville High School, tapping out the melody in her head while the lesson moved around her, constructing in real time a lyric that was ostensibly about a boy she was dating but was actually, with the characteristic double vision of her best work, about the nature of memory itself, about how a song becomes the vessel for a feeling that would otherwise evaporate. She was a junior in high school when it reached number 40 on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart. The album that followed, self-titled, spare, bracingly direct, was received with the warmth that the industry reserves for pleasant surprises, which is a lesser warmth than the kind reserved for anticipated triumphs, but sufficient warmth to justify a second record. Taylor Swift, the album, eventually sold more than 5 million copies in the United States. At the time of its release, she was 16 years old and still doing homework in the back of a tour bus. What the sales figures could not capture was the quality of the audience the album assembled. Taylor Swift did not simply find listeners. She found people, overwhelmingly young women, overwhelmingly in the process of navigating the same treacherous social terrain she was writing about, who experienced her songs not as entertainment but as articulation. The distinction matters. Entertainment is enjoyed and set aside. Articulation is held onto. It names something that has been felt but not said, and in the naming, it creates a bond between the articulator and the articulated, for that is categorically different from the bond of ordinary fandom. The girls who bought Taylor Swift's debut album felt, with a conviction that did not require examination, that she understood them. She did understand them. She was them, or had been them recently enough that the understanding was not manufactured. Fearless, the second album, arrived in November 2008, and it was a different kind of event entirely. Louder, more assured, more deliberately aimed at a crossover audience that country radio had not yet learned it was supposed to resist. It would win the Grammy Award for Album of the Year, making Taylor Swift, at 19, the youngest artist in history to receive the honor. The music industry, which had spent years teaching her the sophisticated language of rejection, was about to discover that she had been listening very carefully and had been taking excellent notes, and that she had quietly built something in the meantime that no one had quite seen coming, except perhaps for the specific woman who had been there at the beginning, waiting in a parking lot in Nashville while her daughter sat alone in a room full of strangers watching everything. But no one understood yet, not Borchetta, not Andrea, not the industry analysts who were already beginning to construct the narrative of the girl from Pennsylvania who conquered Nashville, was that the very terms of the deal signed in 2005, the terms that had seemed, in that hopeful moment of mutual recognition, like the foundation of something rare and reciprocal, were quietly accumulating the weight of a future argument that neither party was yet equipped to have. Chapter 13. Signing with Big Machine Records. The elevator in the Omni Hotel on Charlotte Avenue smelled of carpet cleaner and convention nerves. It was June 2005, and Taylor Swift, 15 years old, stood inside it wearing a sundress her mother had pressed that morning in their rented room, holding a manila folder of original songs she had written herself, not co-written, not polished by a staff room in Midtown Manhattan, but genuinely, stubbornly hers. The folder had a small coffee stain on the lower right corner that she hadn't noticed until they were already in the lobby. She noticed it now. She pressed her thumb over it as the doors opened onto the mezzanine level of the annual country radio seminar, where the hallways moved like slow rivers of cowboy hats and lanyards, and the particular kind of ambient confidence that belongs to men who have spent decades deciding what the rest of America would sing in its cars. She was not supposed to be here in the same way the other artists were here. Most of the performers and hopefuls circulating through the Opryland corridors had arrived through the conventional machinery of the music industry, through managers with Rolodexes, through parents who knew someone, through the patient accumulation of local showcase victories. Taylor had arrived, in part, through an act of deliberate architectural audacity. At age 11, after a talent agent in New York told her family she was promising but not yet ready, she had convinced her parents to uproot their lives from Wyomissing, Pennsylvania, and move to Nashville, Tennessee, not because anyone had asked her to, not because a record deal was waiting, but because she had decided Nashville was where the future lived and she intended to meet it on her own terms. That calculation, made by a child who charted her own geography, would define every negotiation she would enter for the next 2 decades. The Nashville she had arrived in, beginning in 2004, was a city in careful negotiation with its own identity. Country music was experiencing a quiet commercial crisis beneath its outward prosperity. Garth Brooks, who had restructured the entire industry's expectations of scale in the 1990s, had retreated into semi-retirement. The genre was bifurcating, audibly and anxiously, between the traditionalists, who believed country's salvation lay in its twang and its working-class fidelity, and the new crossover architects, producers and label heads who watched Tim McGraw and Faith Hill sell millions by sanding the edges smooth, by making something that could live on a country station on Monday and a pop station on Friday. Into this argument stepped Taylor Swift, a teenager from Pennsylvania who had never actually lived in the South, but who had absorbed its music from her grandmother's RCA records and her own teenage loneliness, and who had already intuited that the battle between authenticity and accessibility was a false one, that the two could be held simultaneously if you were precise enough about your feelings. The labels on Music Row, however, were not immediately convinced. Taylor had been signed to a development deal at RCA Records at 13, which sounded like a beginning, but was, in practice, a kind of elegant deferral, a holding pattern that gave the label the option to develop her without committing to her. They wanted her to record other people's songs. They wanted to wait and see how her voice matured. They wanted, in the particular grammar of the major label system, to own the process of her becoming. Taylor Swift had already decided she would own it herself. She left RCA. She was 14. The decision to walk away from one of the most powerful recording entities in American music, made before she had a driver's license, before she had released a single commercially, represented either extraordinary confidence or extraordinary recklessness, and the line between those two things would be one of the central questions her career continually posed. What made it possible, what transformed the gamble into something more like strategy, was a man she had first encountered at a DreamWorks showcase in Nashville when she was 13, who had looked at her original songs with an attention that was different in quality from the polite interest she usually received. His name was Scott Borchetta, and he was, in the summer of 2005, in the process of doing something that most people in Nashville's establishment considered inadvisable to the point of delusion: starting an independent record label from scratch. Big Machine Records had been incorporated that spring. It had no roster, no distribution infrastructure fully in place, no track record, and no particular reason to believe it would survive in a market dominated by the Nashville arms of Universal, Sony, and Warner. What it had was Borchetta, a man with decades of promotion experience, a precise understanding of radio mechanics, and an almost evangelical certainty that the right artist at the right moment could change the mathematics entirely. When he told Taylor and her parents, in meetings that stretched across several months and spanned careful legal review, that he wanted her to be his first major signing, that he wanted to build the label around her, the offer carried a peculiar kind of power that a conventional major label contract could not replicate. It was not the power of institutional safety. It was the power of mutual necessity. Borchetta needed Taylor to be exceptional. The label had no backup plan. Taylor needed Borchetta to believe in something she already knew, that she could write her own songs, that her songs were already good, and that no development deal or producer-assigned co-writer should stand between those songs and the people who needed to hear them. The contractual arrangements they reached, which gave Swift's own entity, Taylor Swift Entertainment, meaningful participation in creative decisions, were unusual enough in the industry that seasoned Music Row veterans raised their eyebrows when the terms became known. Giving a 15-year-old girl creative guardrails in her own contract was not how things were done. Taylor had insisted. Her parents had insisted. Borchetta, who needed her more than she ultimately needed any single label, had agreed. The insight that animated her negotiating position was not primarily commercial, though its commercial consequences would eventually be historic. It was almost literary. Taylor had been keeping journals since she was a small child, filling them with observations about friendship and heartbreak and the particular social granularity of middle school hallways, and she had come to understand, with the instinct of a natural writer rather than the training of a professional one, that specificity was the engine of emotional recognition. The verse that captured the precise color of someone's truck, the exact nervous gesture of a boy who didn't know she was watching, the particular quality of light at a Friday night football game, these were not decorative details. They were the mechanism by which a listener stopped feeling like they were hearing a song and started feeling like someone had read their diary. If a producer or label executive rewrote her metaphors into something more generically marketable, that engine would stop. The thing that made her songs feel true would be replaced by something that only felt professional. She was 15 years old, and she understood this with the certainty of someone who had already been testing the theory for years. The anecdote that illuminated this most precisely came not from a boardroom, but from a small room in the offices of Sony ATV, the publishing company with whom Taylor had signed a development deal in 2004, the youngest artist they had ever signed. She had been placed with a series of experienced co-writers, accomplished professionals who worked the Nashville system with the reliability of skilled craftsmen. And on more than one occasion, she had arrived at a writing session with a song already substantially complete, had sat down at the piano or picked up her guitar, and had played the song for the room. The co-writers would listen. Then they would suggest changes, a different bridge, a more conventional chord resolution, a hook that hewed closer to what was currently charting. Taylor would listen to these suggestions with the polite intensity of someone who was genuinely considering what was being said. She would then, with a graciousness that made disagreement almost invisible, write it down the way she had written it originally. Not because she was ungenerous or unteachable, but because she had already done the work of understanding why her version was right. The stubbornness was not temperamental. It was structural. She had reasons. Borchetta came to understand this in their early working relationship with a clarity that shaped everything he would subsequently build around her. She was not, he would later reflect to colleagues, an artist who needed to be developed. She was an artist who needed to be distributed. The distinction sounds minor until you consider what it meant for the financial architecture of Big Machine. The label would not be spending its early years trying to shape a raw talent into a marketable entity. The talent arrived already shaped, already in possession of a coherent aesthetic identity, already writing songs that sounded finished because they were finished. What the label needed to provide was infrastructure, promotion expertise, and the radio relationships that Borchetta had spent 20 years cultivating. Taylor would provide everything else. The figure who anchored this early chapter most quietly and with the most long-ranging consequence was Andrea Swift, Taylor's mother, who had given up her career in marketing to become, in effect, the field commander of her daughter's professional life. Andrea attended every meeting, read every contract, asked questions that made lawyers pause, and created around Taylor a buffer of maternal precision that was often mistaken for simple protectiveness. It was not simply protective. It was strategically informed. Andrea Swift had the marketing executive's capacity to see how a brand was being built or eroded in real time, and she applied that capacity to her daughter's career with a thoroughness that the industry would slowly come to respect and occasionally fear. In the early months at Big Machine, when decisions about singles and promotional priorities and radio strategy were being made with the accelerated urgency of a label that needed its flagship act to succeed immediately, it was Andrea who sat in those rooms and made sure that nothing was traded away that could not be recovered. The two of them, mother and daughter, moved through the Nashville industry as a unit, and the unit was more sophisticated than anyone who saw only the teenager with the guitar fully understood. By the time Tim McGraw was released in June 2006, written by Taylor in math class from the perspective of a girl addressing a boy she loved and was about to lose, using a country superstar's name as a kind of emotional shorthand for everything she associated with that summer, the architecture was already in place. The song was hers entirely. The label was behind it entirely. And the radio programmers, whom Borchetta had spent years cultivating, opened their doors in a way that they might not have for a development artist from a major label, because Borchetta called in those relationships personally, and because the song itself was simply very good. It was specific. It was direct. It was written by a 16-year-old who was already old enough to be nostalgic, which is a particular and devastating thing to be. The album that followed, self-titled, released in October 2006, debuted at number 19 on the Billboard 200 and number 5 on the country chart, numbers that would have satisfied most debut artists entirely. Taylor was already dissatisfied with what they implied about ceiling, which is a different thing from being dissatisfied with what they meant. She understood that debut numbers were foundation, not destination, and she was already thinking in the longer architecture of a career rather than the shorter arithmetic of a single release cycle. The tour bookings expanded. The opening slots on bigger bills became headline slots at smaller venues, became something that required a more careful category. The Nashville establishment that had watched a 15-year-old sign with an upstart label began, cautiously and then with increasing enthusiasm, to revise its assessment. What no one in those early big machine offices fully calculated, not Borchetta, not the radio partners, not even Andrea Swift with her marketing precision, was the particular nature of the loyalty that Taylor was beginning to assemble. The fans who found Tim McGraw and then found the album were not engaging with it the way that audiences typically engaged with country debut records, as pleasant background to the rhythms of ordinary life. They were engaging with it the way that people engage with something that has said, precisely, the thing they did not know they needed said. They were treating it as a document. They were writing her letters. They were, in their thousands, and then their hundreds of thousands, beginning to form a community organized entirely around the conviction that Taylor Swift understood them in a way that required loyalty in return. That loyalty, quietly accumulating in the margins of a genre that had not quite figured out what to do with the internet, would prove to be the most disruptive asset in the music industry at the turn of the decade. And the executives who had built their business models on the assumption that they controlled the relationship between artists and audiences had not yet begun to understand what was coming for them. Chapter 14. The Liz Rose Partnership and Songwriting Synergy. The room smelled like carpet adhesive and someone else's ambition. Taylor Swift sat in the anteroom of yet another Nashville publishing house on Music Row, her guitar case propped against her knee like a shield, her mother Andrea stationed quietly in the adjacent chair, with the particular stillness of a woman who had rearranged her entire life and was not about to show the cost of that rearrangement. Taylor was 13 years old. She had a binder. Inside the binder were her songs, printed out and placed in plastic sleeves, organized with the kind of methodical precision that would have seemed eccentric in an adult, and was, in a child, simply unnerving to behold. She had gone door to door on Music Row the previous year with a demo of Dolly Parton and Dixie Chicks covers, knocking on doors the way other children knocked on doors on Halloween, expecting at some level to be rewarded simply for showing up in costume. The doors had opened and then, pleasantly but firmly, closed. What made this particular afternoon different was not the room, which was identical to a dozen other rooms she had sat in. What made it different was that Taylor Swift had decided, somewhere between the parking lot and the door, that she was no longer auditioning. She was arriving. Nashville in 2004 occupied a peculiar and pressurized position in the American cultural imagination. Country music had spent the previous decade engaged in a kind of demographic negotiation, pulled between its working-class rural soul and the commercial gravitational field of mainstream pop. Garth Brooks had sold out stadiums and then, bewilderingly, walked away. The Dixie Chicks had made a comment about President George W. Bush from a London stage in 2003 and found themselves the target of an organized commercial boycott so swift and total that it functioned less like market correction and more like an act of communal excommunication. The lesson the industry absorbed was one of caution, of the fierce and unforgiving loyalty that country audiences demanded, not merely musical loyalty, but cultural, even political loyalty. Into this environment walked a 13-year-old girl from Wyomissing, Pennsylvania, who had grown up listening to Leanne Rimes and Shania Twain, who had performed in musical theater and studied with vocal coaches, and who did not, by any conventional measure, belong. She was not from here. She did not carry the signifiers, the regional accent, the working-class biography, the inherited mythology of truck stops and small towns, that the genre had traditionally required of its storytellers. What she carried instead was something the industry was slower to recognize and faster to underestimate: an almost pathological need to be understood, and the technical instinct to convert that need into a 3-minute song. The tension at the center of Taylor Swift's early Nashville years was not, as it would later be mythologized, simply a story of a prodigy knocking on doors until one opened. It was something more psychologically complicated and more revealing about the machinery of the American music industry. The major labels she had approached were not blind to her talent. Several of them saw it clearly. What they offered in response was not a partnership but a management arrangement. They would develop her, shape her, assign her songs written by professional composers, and position her as a vehicle for content they controlled. It was the standard model, and it had produced stars. But it required the essential surrender of the one thing Taylor Swift had decided in that parking lot was non-negotiable: the songs themselves. She had already begun to understand, with the instinctive territorial certainty of someone who cannot yet fully articulate why a thing matters but knows that it does, that her songs were not a product she was delivering to the industry. They were the point. They were the entire point. To hand them over would be to hand over whatever it was that made her Taylor Swift, rather than a Taylor Swift, shaped, polished, and indistinguishable from the next carefully developed product moving down the assembly line. It was in this climate of productive desperation that Scott Borchetta entered the story. Borchetta was a promotion man at DreamWorks Nashville, a label that had itself just been absorbed and dissolved into a larger corporate entity, and he was preparing to launch an independent label of his own, a venture called Big Machine Records that he was financing partly on faith and partly on the belief that the major label model was beginning to calcify in ways that would eventually prove fatal. He had seen Taylor perform at a DreamWorks Nashville showcase at the Bluebird Cafe, the beloved and unglamorous listening room in Green Hills that had served for decades as the purest meritocracy in American songwriting, a place where the room went quiet and you either held it or you didn't. She held it. Borchetta offered her a deal, and the terms were unusual for an artist of her age and commercial standing. She would co-write her own material. She would have a genuine seat at the creative table. Big Machine was not yet a machine. It was, at the moment of signing, closer to a wager, a founder's bet on an unproven label, staked significantly on an unproven teenager. The collaboration that gave that wager its first and most enduring shape did not happen in a recording studio. It happened in a writing room, and it happened because of Liz Rose. Rose was, by 2004, a respected and experienced presence in the Nashville songwriting community, the kind of writer whose name appeared in the liner notes of albums that sold respectably without ever becoming cultural events, whose craft was impeccable, and whose ego was manageable, which in Nashville's competitive co-writing culture made her something of a rare instrument. She had been connected to Taylor through the publishing infrastructure of Sony ATV, where Taylor had secured a development deal, an arrangement that gave her access to professional co-writers and a Music Row writing room without requiring her to surrender recording control. The pairing on paper was pragmatic. In practice, it was alchemical. Rose has described her role in those early sessions with a disarming and precise modesty that nonetheless contains, if you read it carefully, a remarkable claim. She was not, she has said, teaching Taylor Swift to write songs. She was helping Taylor Swift finish the songs Taylor Swift was already writing, clearing the underbrush, tightening the architecture, finding the precise word that the lyric was reaching toward without quite grasping. The distinction matters enormously. A teacher imposes a grammar. A collaborator like Rose was doing something closer to translation, taking the emotional content that Taylor was generating with unusual specificity and velocity and helping it find its most transmittable form. Taylor would come into the room with a feeling, a situation, a real and often barely fictionalized incident from her high school life in Hendersonville, Tennessee, and the two of them would work it into something that could travel. What Rose recognized early, and what she has spoken about with genuine admiration in the years since, was that Taylor's lyrics were not the approximate emotional gestures that most teenage songwriters produced. They were specific. They were anchored in particular details. A particular look across a classroom, a particular text message unanswered, a particular way a boy held his guitar. And that specificity was not a limitation, but a source of almost electric power. The details made the listener feel that the song was about them, precisely because the song was so specifically about someone else. It was a paradox that would define Taylor Swift's commercial appeal for the next 2 decades. And it was already fully present at 14. Teardrops on My Guitar, the song that would become one of the defining documents of this period, illustrates the dynamic with unusual clarity. The song is built on a real person, a boy named Drew Hardwick whom Taylor knew at Hendersonville High School, who would talk to her about another girl he liked, oblivious to the fact that Taylor was in love with him. The emotional situation is common, almost archetypal. What is not common is what Taylor did with it. She named him. Not metaphorically, not with a composite pseudonym constructed to provide comfortable distance. She named him. Drew looks at me. I fake a smile so he won't see. And then she built the entire architecture of the song around the unbearable specificity of that detail, the way unrequited feeling sharpens every ordinary interaction into something almost unbearable. Drew Hardwick later gave interviews, expressing a mixture of surprise and good humor about his accidental immortality. Taylor, characteristically, had already moved on to the next song. In the writing room with Rose, a routine took shape that would persist across years of creative partnership. Taylor would arrive, having already worked through the emotional skeleton of the song. She was not, Rose noted, the kind of collaborator who showed up empty-handed and waited to be inspired. She arrived with momentum, with urgency, with the sense that the song was already inside her and needed to be gotten out before something changed. Rose's role was to channel that urgency without blunting it, to help Taylor find the chorus that the verse was already secretly pointing toward. The work was fast by Nashville standards. Sessions that produced complete drafts in a single afternoon were not unusual. The speed was partly a function of Taylor's emotional stockpile, the accumulation of documented feeling that she had been banking since childhood, and partly a function of something harder to name. A kind of fearlessness about emotional exposure that most writers spend years trying to cultivate and some never manage at all. The sessions with Rose also produced, over time, a more refined understanding of the form that would define Taylor's commercial breakthrough, the country pop synthesis that her debut album, released in October 2006, embodied with confident precision. The album bore her name on the cover and her fingerprints on every track, and it entered a marketplace that was not quite sure what category to assign it. Country radio embraced it with some wariness. Pop radio was intrigued, but not yet committed. The ambiguity would prove to be an asset. The album lived in the space between formats, which meant it was accessible to listeners who might have rejected a more categorically pure product. It debuted at number 5 on the Billboard 200 and eventually spent more than 200 weeks on the Billboard Country Albums chart, a figure that belongs less to the register of commercial success and more to the register of cultural settlement. The gradual, irreversible way a piece of work becomes part of the furniture of a particular time. What the chart numbers do not capture is the sociological fact that was quietly assembling itself in those years. A generation of teenage girls, many of them navigating the newly unstable social terrain of early social media and the specific loneliness it could produce, were finding in Taylor Swift's songs something they had not quite found before. Not inspiration exactly, and not mere entertainment. Something closer to accurate description. The sensation of being seen with precision by someone who had been in the exact same room and felt the exact same thing and had the ability, which they did not, to make it into art. The relationship between Taylor Swift and her audience was forming its unusual and defining shape, and neither party fully understood yet what they were building or how binding the structure would become. Scott Borchetta watched the sales figures and understood that the wager was paying. He also understood, with the particular attention of a founder protecting a primary asset, that the thing he had signed was not simply a commercially viable artist. He had signed someone whose relationship to her own creative output was unusually, even ferociously proprietary, someone who had already demonstrated that the songs were not a deliverable. They were the self. Managing that self, and the commercial entity that was beginning to crystallize around it, would require a kind of institutional diplomacy that Big Machine was still inventing as it went, learning the specific gravity of the person at its center. Liz Rose would later reflect that what struck her most about those early writing sessions was not Taylor's talent, which was evident, but her patience, a quality that seemed to contradict the urgency she brought to every room. She was patient about the work in the way that people are patient when they believe, with a certainty they cannot justify but will not abandon, that the work is going to matter. She revised. She waited for the right word. She held the line on a lyric that someone else might have softened into commercial safety. It was patience in the service of precision, and it suggested someone who was not in a hurry to be famous so much as she was in a hurry to be exactly right. The debut album had barely finished its long residency on the charts when Taylor began writing the songs that would become Fearless, a record that would reframe every expectation the industry had formed about what she was and what she could reach, and that would arrive with the force of something that had been building quietly for years, carrying inside it both the hunger of the girl who had organized her songs in plastic sleeves and something new and more dangerous, the confidence of a young woman who had just discovered that the hunger was justified and was no longer remotely interested in knocking. Chapter 15. Tim McGraw and the debut album launch. The humidity hit her like a wall of wet wool the morning Scott Borchetta drove her to the warehouse space on Belmont Boulevard that would become the first headquarters of his not-yet-launched label. Taylor Swift was 16, and she sat in the passenger seat with her knees pressed together and a spiral notebook balanced on her thighs, a pen already uncapped because she was always already working. Outside the window, Nashville shimmered in the particular way it does in high summer, the asphalt going soft at the edges, the oaks darkened with heat, the city radiating a kind of stubborn, beautiful indifference to anyone who had come here with a dream and expected a welcome. She looked at the building. She looked at her notebook. She wrote something down. Nobody who was there that morning can remember exactly what it was, but everyone who knew Taylor Swift in those years would tell you the same thing. She was never simply present in a moment. She was already converting it into something she could use. To understand what it meant to be Taylor Swift arriving in Nashville in 2004 at the age of 14, and to understand what it would mean to release a debut album there 2 years later, you have to understand the specific and rather brutal geometry of the country music industry at that precise moment in American cultural life. Country music in the mid-2000s was a genre in the grip of a productive tension it could barely name. The post-9/11 wave of flag-waving anthems, Toby Keith's Belligerence, Alan Jackson's Elegy, had crested and was pulling back, leaving the industry uncertain about what came next. Female artists faced a particular squeeze. Radio programmers, still overwhelmingly male, operated on an informal but ironclad quota system that rarely permitted more than one woman per hour of airplay. Shania Twain had crossed country into pop and paid a reputational price among purists. The Dixie Chicks had been effectively burned at the stake of patriotic opinion in 2003 for a single offhand remark about President Bush, and their commercial destruction sent a message to every woman holding a guitar in a Nashville rehearsal room: the audience could turn, and it could turn fast, and there would be no one to catch you. The industry's response to this anxiety was to reach instinctively for youth, but youth on its own terms, scrubbed clean, radio-ready, carefully managed. A 16-year-old girl with a gift for melody and a self-possessed intensity that unnerved grown men in boardrooms was not exactly what anyone had planned for. The core obstacle Taylor faced was not talent. Everyone who heard her sing conceded that immediately, sometimes reluctantly, but credibility. Nashville's credibility was a specific, guarded currency, and it was not freely extended to teenagers from Pennsylvania who had decamped to Tennessee on the strength of parental sacrifice and a child's conviction. The industry ran on relationships built over decades, on session musicians who had played on 10,000 records, on producers who communicated in a private language of technical shorthand and historical reference. It ran, in other words, on exactly the kind of institutional seniority that a 16-year-old by definition could not possess. DreamWorks Records had passed on signing her, and that rejection, the first major label rejection of her professional life, was not simply a business setback. It was, in the specific emotional algebra of adolescence, a verdict. The people who were supposed to know said no. The question the rejection planted, and that she would spend the next several years answering with escalating ferocity, was whether those people actually knew anything at all. What Scott Borchetta represented was a gamble dressed up as an opportunity, and Taylor Swift was perceptive enough to understand both halves of that equation. Big Machine Records launched in 2005 with essentially no infrastructure, no distribution muscle, no proven roster, and no track record. What it had was Borchetta's connections within the industry, his salesman's belief in his own instincts, and one artist, her. She was the bet and the better simultaneously. She had chosen a startup over the safety of an established label, and she had done so with a clarity of reasoning that was startling in someone her age. The established labels, she understood, would own her in ways that went beyond contract language. They would sand her edges. They would assign her producers and songwriting collaborators and image consultants and radio liaisons. And somewhere in that process, the specific and irreplaceable thing that made her her would be optimized away. Big Machine was fragile and new, and that was precisely the point. She could shape it because it did not yet have a shape. The story that illuminates this quality of strategic self-awareness more completely than almost any other from this period involves the writing of Tim McGraw, which she composed during her freshman year of high school, in math class, in the margins of a page she was supposed to be using for something else. The song is ostensibly about a summer romance ending when a boy leaves for college, and the detail at its center, telling a boy that when he thinks of her, she hopes he hears Tim McGraw, is the kind of image that appears simple until you examine how specifically it works. It does not say she loves him. It does not ask him to stay. It finds instead a piece of shared cultural shorthand, a country singer whose music meant something to both of them, and uses it as a vessel for a feeling that direct language would flatten. It is an emotionally sophisticated maneuver, executed with apparent naturalness, which is one of the hardest things to do in any art form. When she brought the song to her creative collaborators, there was immediate recognition that something unusual was happening. Liz Rose, who would become one of her earliest and most essential songwriting partners, later described her first sessions with Taylor as watching someone who had arrived already knowing what she was doing and needing, not instruction, but a sounding board. The song was released as a single in June of 2006, while Taylor was still 16 years old. It debuted at number 40 on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart, and climbed with a patient, deliberate steadiness that mirrored the patience and deliberateness of the person who had written it in the margins of a math worksheet. Liz Rose deserves more than a footnote here, because the relationship that developed between them in those early years was, in its quiet way, one of the more remarkable creative partnerships in modern country music. Remarkable partly because of how asymmetrical it seemed on its surface, and how equal it actually was. Rose was an established presence in Nashville's songwriting community, experienced enough to have strong opinions, and flexible enough to subordinate them when something better was in the room. What she recognized in Taylor almost immediately was not simply talent, but what might be called narrative intelligence, the ability to build a song the way a fiction writer builds a scene, with specific sensory detail, dramatic structure, and an ending that earned its emotion rather than simply asserting it. Rose would later say that her primary function in their sessions was to keep things from getting in the way, that Taylor arrived with the songs largely formed, and the job was refinement, not construction. This was not false modesty on Rose's part. It was an accurate account of a working relationship that treated a teenager as a peer, and that Taylor, for her part, navigated with a social grace that belied her age. She did not condescend upward. She asked questions, took notes, and incorporated feedback with the efficiency of someone who had no time to be precious about her own ideas, because she had enough ideas that no single one of them needed to be protected. The self-titled debut album, released on October 24, 2006, is an artifact that rewards close listening in part because of how thoroughly it resists the listener's instinct to condescend to it. It was produced primarily by Nathan Chapman, who had worked with Taylor in the demo stages and understood, as larger and more established producers might not have, that the album's emotional honesty was its commercial strategy as well as its artistic statement. The instrumentation is traditional country without being nostalgic about it. Fiddles and steel guitar occupy their proper places without irony, without the knowing wink that would have signaled a young artist seeking credibility with an older audience. The songs are written from inside adolescent experience rather than above it, and this is a more difficult thing to achieve than it sounds. The temptation, when writing about young emotion from within it, is either to minimize, to pretend the feelings are smaller than they are, or to inflate, to reach for a gravitas the material cannot support. Taylor did neither. Teardrops on My Guitar, built around a real boy named Drew who talked to her about another girl without knowing she loved him, has a specificity of humiliation that adult listeners recognized in their bones. Our song was written for a school talent show, and sounds like it was written for a school talent show, which is not a criticism. It sounds like joy assembled quickly and without apology, and joy assembled that way is rarer on record than sorrow carefully arranged. The album sold 40,000 copies in its first week, modest numbers by the standards of major label ambition, but the beginning of a word-of-mouth momentum that the industry, oriented as it was toward first-week performance metrics, did not yet have the tools to measure or fully understand. What was happening, in those months after the album's release, was something that the music industry's existing frameworks were genuinely ill-equipped to process. Taylor Swift was building her audience the way someone who had grown up on the early internet would build an audience, directly, personally, at the level of the individual listener. She maintained a MySpace presence with a consistency and specificity that her label's marketing team had not requested and could not have engineered. She responded to fan messages. She made her creative process visible. She treated the people who had bought her record not as consumers at the end of a distribution chain, but as participants in something ongoing, something that had not yet become what it was going to become. This was instinct dressed up as strategy, or strategy that had become so internalized it functioned as instinct, and it was almost certainly incomprehensible to any Nashville executive who had come up through the traditional industry mechanisms of radio promotion, retail placement, and tour support. She was doing something they had no category for, and it was working, and they were not entirely sure why. The album would eventually be certified platinum 6 times over, a commercial trajectory so slow building and so sustained that it confounded the conventional wisdom about how debut country albums behave. It spent 24 weeks at the top of the Billboard Top Country Albums chart, not consecutively, but across a period of years, which was itself a kind of argument, an ongoing insistence on being counted. By any reasonable measure, it was a success. By Taylor Swift's internal measure, which was calibrated not against what other 16-year-olds had done, but against what she believed she was capable of doing, it was the foundation, not the destination. She said as much, in various ways, in various interviews during this period, with a consistency that was not arrogance and not false modesty, but something more unsettling to the people around her: certainty. She was certain she was going to be very large, and she was certain she had not yet begun to demonstrate why. By the time she turned 18 and began writing the songs that would become Fearless, the commercial and critical landscape had shifted in ways that nobody had anticipated when a teenager walked into a Nashville warehouse with a spiral notebook and an uncapped pen. She had earned the right, inside the industry, to be taken seriously, and she had done it without becoming what the industry expected of its young female artists: tractable, grateful, styled towards someone else's vision of marketability. She had remained, with a stubbornness that people who loved her found charming, and people who had underestimated her found irritating, entirely herself. The songs she was writing now were bigger and more architecturally ambitious, the emotions less confined to a single high school hallway, and she was beginning to suspect, not yet certain, but beginning to suspect, that the audience she had built in the country genre was not the ceiling of her ambition, but merely the first floor of a structure she had not yet finished imagining. What she did not yet know, what she could not yet see from where she stood in the late autumn of 2007, was that the climb she was about to begin would cost her things she did not know she was carrying, and that the machine she had partnered with and the one she had become were not always going to want the same things. Chapter 16. The Grassroots Radio Promotion Campaign. The parking lot of WKXK in Beckley, West Virginia, smells like asphalt and cigarette smoke, and the faint ghost of French fries from a Wendy's across the service road. It is 7:43 in the morning. A 16-year-old girl in a sundress and cowboy boots is standing beside a rental car, holding a box of homemade cookies wrapped in cellophane with a blue ribbon, waiting for someone to unlock the station's back door. She has been awake since 4. She drove 2 hours from the previous stop, a mid-market station in Charleston, where the program director spent 12 minutes talking about his boat before she managed to play him 30 seconds of a song she had written in her bedroom 8 months ago. She does not complain about the boat. She does not look at the pavement with anything resembling defeat. When the door finally opens and a man in a fleece vest squints at her like she is a lost delivery, Taylor Swift smiles the way people smile when they have already decided, at some foundational level, that the world is going to come around. She is not yet famous. She is not yet anything the industry would formally recognize. She is a teenager with a publishing deal, a development contract, and a mother named Andrea who is behind the wheel of the rental car, hands folded in her lap, watching her daughter through the windshield with an expression that holds both ferocity and restraint in equal measure. This is the life they have chosen. This is what chosen looks like at 7:45 on a Tuesday in West Virginia. To understand what Taylor Swift was doing in that parking lot, what she was doing in hundreds of parking lots across 40-some states across the better part of 2 years, you have to understand what country radio was in 2005 and 2006, and what it meant to exist within it as an unknown. Country radio in that era was not merely a promotional vehicle. It was a gatekeeper so absolute, so consolidated in its power, that a song without airplay was functionally a song that did not exist. The industry had spent the decade following the Telecommunications Act of 1996 consolidating station ownership into the hands of a small number of corporations, and those corporations had standardized their playlists around a narrow bandwidth of proven sound: male voices, trucks, small towns rendered in amber, heartbreak that resolved itself within 3.5 minutes. A teenage girl with a guitar who wrote her own material and wore her influences on her sleeve. Shania Twain, yes, but also Def Leppard, also the kind of narrative detail that came from reading too many books alone, was not what the format had been engineered to absorb. The format was not, in any organic sense, waiting for her. What was also true in 2005 was that the music industry as a whole was burning. Digital piracy had eroded album sales to a degree that major labels were still struggling to quantify or psychologically accept. iTunes had launched 2 years prior and changed the atomic unit of music commerce from the album to the single, a shift that nobody in a corner office had fully reckoned with. The country market was slightly more insulated from these forces than pop or rock. Its audience was older, more habitual, more likely to still walk into a Walmart and purchase a physical disc, but the fragility was real and the anxiety was ambient. Into this environment walked Scott Borchetta, a promotional veteran who had spent years inside the major label system and had concluded, with the particular clarity of someone who has watched an institution calcify from the inside, that the only interesting future was the one he built himself. Big Machine Records launched in 2005 with a roster of 1. Taylor Swift was the entire bet. The arrangement was unusual, and the risk was not evenly distributed. Borchetta had industry contacts and genuine promotional instincts, but he did not have infrastructure. He did not have the regional promotion teams that Universal or Sony could deploy to work a single across 300 stations simultaneously. What he had was a 16-year-old who had been honing her interpersonal gifts since elementary school, who had gone door to door in Nashville, handing demo CDs to label executives at an age when most children were still negotiating bedtimes, and who possessed an almost biological drive to make every person in front of her feel as though they were the most important person in the room. Borchetta saw what this could be. He called it a promotional strategy. Taylor Swift called it in her way Tuesday. The campaign was not spontaneous. It was planned with a precision that belied its folksy surface. Andrea Swift, a former marketing executive who had given up her career to manage her daughters, mapped out the country radio landscape the way a field general maps terrain. She identified which markets were the most influential, which program directors were the most accessible, which regional clusters could be driven in a single swing. She and Taylor would load the rental car with CDs, with baked goods, with handwritten notes. They would call ahead. They would follow up. They would remember details, the name of a PD's wife, the mascot of a station's hometown team. And they would deploy those details with the kind of careful affection that could not be entirely performed because, in Taylor's case, it was not entirely performed. She was genuinely interested in people. This was not a skill she had developed. It was a disposition she had arrived with, and it happened to be precisely the disposition that a grassroots radio campaign required. What the campaign demanded in exchange was something less romantic, the willingness to be diminished repeatedly without allowing the diminishment to register in any visible way. Program directors who kept her waiting. Station managers who had not listened to the CD she had sent 3 weeks prior. Interviewers who asked her age, with an inflection that was really a question about whether she belonged there at all. There was a station in the Midwest. The specific city has softened into anonymity over the years, which is perhaps how Taylor has chosen it, where a midday host asked her on air, with performative skepticism, who had actually written her songs. She answered him the way she always answered that question, directly, with titles and co-writers named, with a composure that was itself a kind of argument. She did not flinch. She did not explain herself more than once. She simply stated the facts and moved forward, and the implicit message was that the question had not wounded her, not because it couldn't, but because she had already decided it wouldn't. This was, in miniature, the essential Taylor Swift maneuver of this period, the absorption of doubt into something that functioned over time as fuel. She was not unaffected by the skepticism. She was affected by it in the precise way that someone with a long memory and a songwriter's instinct for cataloging emotional experience is always affected. She filed it away. The radio programmer who looked through her was not forgotten. He was simply deferred. The single that anchored the campaign was Tim McGraw, released in June 2006. The song was, on its surface, about a boy she had loved the previous summer, a boy who was heading to college while she stayed behind. On a deeper register, it was about time, about the way a specific song can hold a moment in amber and keep it from disappearing the way moments do. She had written it in math class, during a period when she had concluded that math class was not the best use of her particular set of gifts. The composition itself was disciplined, a verse structure that built emotional pressure without releasing it too early, a chorus that named its hook directly and without apology, a lyrical specificity, his name as the thing she hoped would make him think of her, that was unusual for the format. Country radio in 2006 trafficked in the general. Taylor Swift arrived with the particular. It worked because of the campaign and despite it, both at once. The radio relationships that Andrea had painstakingly cultivated meant that programmers in secondary markets were inclined to give the record a hearing they might not have otherwise granted. But Tim McGraw ultimately moved because it was the kind of song that teenage girls played for each other on MySpace at midnight and then played again. The internet had not yet remade the music industry's promotional logic, but it was already creating parallel circuits of influence that bypassed radio entirely. Taylor Swift's MySpace following grew during this period, at a rate that her label monitored with a combination of excitement and mild bewilderment. She was talking directly to her audience in a register that was intimate and unmediated, answering comments, posting tour dates, treating the platform as an extension of the bedroom journal impulse that had produced her songs in the first place. The grassroots radio campaign and the grassroots digital campaign were two expressions of the same underlying strategy. Be everywhere, be genuine, be so consistently present that indifference eventually becomes impossible. The figure who shaped the texture of this period most directly was not Borchetta, whose influence operated at the structural level, nor Andrea, whose presence was so constant as to be almost atmospheric. It was a woman named Liz Rose, the co-writer with whom Taylor had developed a Tuesday afternoon writing partnership that had already yielded several album tracks. Rose was a seasoned Nashville professional, pragmatic and dry-witted, with a gift for finding the clean, emotional line buried inside Taylor's enthusiastic prolixity. Their collaboration had a particular rhythm. Taylor would arrive at Rose's office overflowing with narrative, situations, feelings, images that cascaded into one another without clear hierarchy, and Rose would listen until she found the phrase that organized everything. She was not intimidated by Taylor's certainty, nor by her youth. She treated her as a peer because she recognized, in the quality of Taylor's instincts, that peer was the only accurate designation. During the radio campaign months, Rose was the person Taylor called when a session had gone badly, when a programmer had been dismissive, when the road had compacted itself into a series of interchangeable green room sofas, and the larger purpose of all of it had temporarily blurred. Rose did not offer comfort of the conventional variety. She offered the next Tuesday, the next song, the next chance to transmute the green room sofas into something that would outlast them. This was not therapy. It was craft as survival strategy, and it worked because both women understood that the song was ultimately more durable than the slight that had inspired it. By the fall of 2006, Tim McGraw had reached the top 40 on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart, a result that Borchetta's team had hoped for but not guaranteed. By the spring of 2007, Taylor Swift's debut album had gone gold. She was performing at county fairs and opening slots for established acts, adjusting to the specific social economy of the tour bus and the green room in real time, absorbing lessons about stamina and hierarchy, and the gap between a crowd's enthusiasm and the industry's recognition that were foundational in ways she could not yet fully name. She was 17 years old. She was learning at a rate that older, more comfortable artists simply could not match, because she had not yet accumulated the habits that slow learning down. Everything was still first time. Everything was still data. The radio programmers, who had made her wait in parking lots at 7:45, were, by the end of 2007, spinning her record in drive time. Some of them, in subsequent interviews and profile pieces, would describe her arrival at their stations as though they had immediately recognized what she was. The details of those early mornings, the cellophane-wrapped cookies, the rental car, the smile that held its ground regardless of the reception it received, had softened into a promotional legend that the industry could fold into its own self-congratulatory narrative, a story about how country radio had discovered and developed a star. The more accurate story was that she had developed them. She had made herself into something that a format resistant to novelty could not ultimately refuse, not because the format had evolved, but because she had worked the rooms and worked the songs and worked the phones until the distance between what she was and what they were willing to play had collapsed entirely. But no one standing in those parking lots in 2005 and 2006 could have anticipated what even Taylor, filing away her grievances and her Tuesday afternoons and her MySpace replies, could not have fully modeled, was that the machinery she was learning to operate was already approaching obsolescence, and that the moment her fluency with it became complete, the landscape would shift in ways that would make that fluency both irrelevant and, unexpectedly, the foundation of something far more dangerous to every institution that had made her wait. Chapter 17. Opening for Giants, Learning the Arena Craft. The stage is too big. That is the first thing Taylor Swift understands when she walks out into the mouth of it, not in the way a performer understands scale abstractly, as a logistical fact about square footage and lighting rigs, but in the way a 16-year-old understands it when 10,000 people are already seated and none of them came for her. The arena breathes on its own. It has a pulse, low and indifferent, the collective murmur of a crowd still finding their seats, still finishing their nachos, still laughing at a joke someone told in the parking lot. She is the reason they arrived early, if they arrived early at all, and she knows this. She grips the neck of her guitar the way a person grips a handrail on a moving train, not from fear of falling exactly, but from a primal recognition that the ground beneath her is no longer still. The spotlight finds her before the crowd does. For a moment she stands inside it alone, the noise of the arena folding around her like a wave that hasn't decided yet whether to carry her or bury her. She is 16 years old. She has driven here from Nashville in a van that smells like fast food and guitar polish. She has a debut album that hasn't been released yet, a name that approximately 300 people in this building would recognize, and roughly 45 minutes to make the other 9,700 care. She steps to the microphone. She begins. To understand what Taylor Swift is doing in an arena in 2006, opening for Rascal Flatts or George Strait or Brad Paisley, depending on the month and the routing, you have to understand what Nashville was doing in 2006 and what it was not doing. Country music at mid-decade was in a state of managed confidence. The Dixie Chicks had been effectively exiled from mainstream radio 3 years earlier after Natalie Mains's offhand criticism of President George W. Bush at a London concert, and the industry had responded to that crisis not with nuance but with consolidation. Radio programmers tightened playlists. Labels leaned harder into proven formulas. Male vocalists with pickup trucks and working-class credibility, female vocalists with heartbreak and rhinestones, and very little patience for anything that didn't fit cleanly into either column. Country music's dominant mode was reassurance, of identity, of tradition, of a certain vision of American life that felt to its audience like solid ground. Into this environment, Scott Borchetta had launched Big Machine Records in 2005, with Taylor Swift as its foundational act, which was either an act of visionary courage or commercial recklessness, depending on who you asked and when. A teenage girl who wrote her own songs was not the industry's default bet. She did not have a voice that country radio's gatekeepers would immediately recognize as powerful in the conventional sense. It was high, clear, conversational, a voice that told stories rather than demonstrated range. What she had instead was something harder to categorize. She had specificity. Her songs were not about heartbreak in the abstract. They were about a particular boy, a particular hallway, a particular moment after school when the light was doing a particular thing. This specificity was either her greatest asset or, to a format that preferred its emotions broad and its references universal, her greatest liability. The touring was not incidental to this calculation. It was, in fact, the center of it. Borchetta and Swift's management understood something about the country music industry that the industry itself sometimes forgot. Radio could make you known, but live performance made you real. The artists who endured in country music were not always the ones with the most airplay. They were the ones whose fans felt they had personally witnessed something. You built that kind of loyalty one arena at a time, one opening slot at a time, 45 minutes in front of someone else's audience, trying to convert strangers into believers before the headliner walked on and made everyone forget you existed. It was, in the most literal sense, the hardest possible way to build a career. It was also the most durable. The hurdle was not the crowd. Or rather, the crowd was only the surface of the problem. The deeper problem was structural, almost philosophical. An opening act in an arena exists in a condition of institutional invisibility. The sound system has been tuned for the headliner's vocal register. The lighting design has been optimized for the headliner's staging. The set list has been constructed to warm up an audience, which means it cannot take too long, cannot ask too much, cannot leave the crowd so spent that they have nothing left to give the person they actually paid to see. Every variable of the environment works against the opening act's capacity to make a lasting impression. The savvier opening acts recognized this and made peace with it, treating arena slots as brand exposure rather than genuine artistic events. Show up, play through, move on. The crowds barely remembered them. Taylor Swift did not make peace with it. This is the fact that her fellow musicians on those early tours would recall years later, often with a mixture of admiration and something close to incredulity. She treated every opening set as if it were the only show she would ever play. This was not mere ambition performing itself for an audience, though ambition was certainly present. It was something more specific. She had made a decision, conscious or otherwise, that the condition of being ignored was not a condition she was willing to passively accept. So she did not simply stand at the microphone and sing. She moved. She talked to the audience, not in the scripted patter of a seasoned performer working through a practice set list, but in the unpracticed, slightly rambling way of a teenager who has something urgent to say and is not entirely sure how to say it. She told them about the songs before she sang them. She told them who they were about. She told them, sometimes, about the specific Tuesday afternoon when she had written the bridge, or the specific fight that had made the chorus necessary. She was dismantling the fourth wall before the audience had time to build it. The moment that clarifies all of this, the keyhole through which her larger character becomes visible, did not happen on a main stage. It happened in a parking lot in Ohio, sometime in the winter of 2006 or early 2007, during a run of dates opening for Rascal Flatts. A small group of fans had gathered near the tour bus before the show, the kind of pre-show cluster that forms in every city. 15 or 20 people who had arrived early enough and cared enough to stand in the cold on the chance of seeing someone. Most opening acts, period, do not stop. There is always another obligation, another soundcheck note to address, another logistical reason to keep moving. Taylor Swift stopped. She spent 45 minutes in that parking lot. She signed everything. She took every photograph. She asked people their names and appeared in the accounts of everyone present to actually retain them, to use them again in conversation moments later, in the way that people who are genuinely paying attention use names rather than the way people who are merely being polite deploy them. When someone told her they had driven from 2 states away, she did not respond with the reflexive gratitude of celebrity. She responded with the slightly stunned, slightly mortified recognition of someone who understands, for the first time, what that distance actually means. She understood it as a debt. She filed it as an obligation. This was not a strategy. Or if it was a strategy, it had already become something more than that. What Taylor Swift was constructing in those parking lots and those 45-minute sets was not a fan base in the industry's conventional sense, a demographic, a target audience, a consumer segment. She was constructing something that functioned more like a web of individual relationships, each one small and specific and felt. The girl who had driven from Kentucky. The boy who had bought her album before the first single charted. The family in the 4th row who had brought a handwritten sign. She was storing all of it, not literally perhaps, but in some larger accounting that would shape every business decision and artistic choice she made for the next 2 decades. Gary LeVox of Rascal Flatts watched some of this from a distance and made a point of telling people about it later. He had seen a lot of opening acts. He had seen talented ones who coasted, charismatic ones who squandered their gifts, hardworking ones who lacked the instinct to know which moments mattered. Swift had something different, something he struggled to articulate precisely but kept returning to. She seemed to understand that every interaction was permanent. That nothing was throwaway. That the fan she was meeting in the parking lot in Columbus, Ohio in February would remember this for the rest of their life, which meant that she would remember it too, which meant that she had better be fully present for it. LeVox, a man who had himself sold tens of millions of records, told people that he had found himself watching her open for his own band and thinking that the positioning was going to be very briefly reversed. Brad Paisley arrived at a similar conclusion from a different angle. Paisley was, in the mid-2000s, one of country music's most sophisticated craftsmen, a guitarist of genuine technical brilliance who also happened to be an astute observer of the industry he inhabited. He had agreed to take Swift on a leg of his tour, in part because Borchetta had asked, and in part because he was curious about her. What struck him, he would later say, was not her ambition, which was obvious, but her patience. She did not seem to be in a hurry, in the way that young artists who understood their own talent were usually in a hurry. She watched. She stood in the wings during his sets and studied his stagecraft, the way a graduate student studies a primary source, not passively, but with the specific attention of someone who is extracting applicable principles. She asked him questions about his guitar work that were more precise than the questions she was supposed to be asking at 16. She seemed, in some fundamental way, to be treating this entire period not as a waiting room before her real career began, but as a classroom from which she intended to extract everything available. George Strait was different. He was not the kind of artist who formed mentoring relationships easily or naturally. He was courteous and professional and essentially private. A man whose dominance of country music for 3 decades had been built on a kind of sovereign self-containment that did not invite the usual categories of industry friendship. But there are accounts from crew members on that tour of Swift appearing near the stage during Strait's sound checks, not intruding, not attempting conversation, simply observing. The king of country, one of the most successful recording artists in the history of popular music, methodically working through his own craft. She watched until someone politely suggested she find somewhere else to be. She found somewhere else to be, and then, when no one was paying particular attention, drifted back. By the end of 2007, Taylor Swift's debut album had sold more than 2 million copies. She had won the Country Music Association's Horizon Award, the prize given to an emerging artist of the year. She had charted multiple singles. She had done all of this while spending a significant portion of her professional life as a guest in other people's shows, borrowing their audiences, performing in sound systems calibrated for someone else's voice, working without the safety net of her own established crowd. The arena craft she had been learning, the navigation of scale, the conversion of strangers, the patience to treat every night as a permanent record, had become, without anyone quite marking the transition, the central infrastructure of her career. The fans she had met in the parking lots were still there. They had told other people. They had told the story of the girl who had stopped in the cold, and learned their names and asked how far they had driven, and looked at them as though the answer mattered. They were buying the album, not because radio had told them to, but because something had happened in a parking lot in Ohio that they were still trying to explain to themselves. They were spreading something that did not yet have a name, but would, in time, become the most distinctive feature of the Taylor Swift phenomenon. The conviction, distributed among millions of individual people, that she had chosen them specifically. That the relationship was personal. That it was mutual. What none of them knew, what Swift herself may not have fully known, was that the very act of building that conviction at this scale, that intimate, was creating an expectation she would spend the rest of her career trying to honor and would, in moments she could not yet foresee, find herself unable to fully keep. Chapter 18. The Taylor Swift Fandom Strategy. The cursor blinks. The screen glows a pale blue in the dark of her bedroom, and Taylor Swift, 13 years old, types another message to a stranger. Not a stranger exactly, someone who found her on MySpace, someone who clicked play on the lo-fi recording she uploaded 2 weeks ago, someone who left a comment that read, simply, "I felt this." She types back within minutes. She always types back within minutes. Her mother, Andrea, has learned to check the clock before knocking. If it's past midnight and the blue light is still seeping under the door, Taylor is not sleeping. She is working. The distinction, even at 13, is not one she would recognize as meaningful. For Taylor Allison Swift, correspondence is the work. Connection is the product. She understood this before she had the vocabulary for it, before the record deal, before the sequined dresses, before the #1 debuts. In the glow of that early aughts monitor, fingers moving fast across a keyboard she has already worn smooth in certain places, she is already building something that the music industry does not yet have a name for. To understand what she was constructing in those late-night hours requires understanding what the world looked like to a teenage girl trying to break into country music in 2004. Nashville was a city of gatekeepers, and the gates were tall. The industry ran on relationships forged in conference rooms and golf courses, on handshake agreements between label executives and radio programmers, on a model of artist development that was fundamentally top-down. A label found a talent, shaped the talent, presented the talent, and the fans received what they were given. The listener was a passive recipient. The artist was a managed commodity. The intermediary, the label, the radio station, the magazine, was everything. Country radio, in particular, operated like a closed ecosystem. Female artists had always occupied a precarious position within it. The so-called boom and bust cycle that critics had begun documenting through the late 90s and early 2000s saw women's voices rotated on and off playlists with a particular ruthlessness, their commercial windows treated as inherently narrower, their longevity presumed to be more fragile than that of their male counterparts. Shania Twain had crossed country into pop stratosphere and paid a price in Nashville credibility. The Chicks, known then as the Dixie Chicks, had exercised political speech and been effectively erased from country radio within weeks of a single remark in a London concert hall in 2003. The lesson the industry believed it was teaching was about staying in your lane. The lesson a careful observer might extract was different. The infrastructure was brittle, the power concentrated, and the gate only needed one determined person with a different kind of key. Taylor Swift arrived in Nashville with her mother in the fall of 2004, having extracted a promise from her parents that the family would relocate from Wyomissing, Pennsylvania, if she could secure meetings on Music Row. She secured the meetings. She was 14. She carried a demo CD of karaoke covers in her backpack and handed them, with a poise that unnerved grown men in suits, to label representatives who had heard every pitch and manufactured every kind of confidence. Most of the meetings ended the same way, professionally, warmly, and without consequence. The labels saw potential they didn't know how to package. They heard a voice still finding its weight. They offered development deals, arrangements that would give them an option on her future in exchange for a holding pattern in her present. She walked away from all of them. The decision was not impulsive, and it was not made alone. Taylor and Andrea Swift had studied the architecture of the music business with the same rigor that Taylor had spent years applying to the architecture of a song. A development deal was, in practical terms, a waiting room. The label could develop her for years and then decline to sign her, having spent the intervening time shaping her into something market-ready for someone else. What Taylor wanted, what she had been precise enough to articulate to her mother even at 14, was not to be developed. She wanted to be released. She wanted to make something now, while the feelings that were powering her songs still lived at the surface of her skin, before the industry could sand them down into something more palatable and consequently less real. Scott Borchetta found her before she could find him, which is how origin stories in music so often work. The legend travels backward through the facts until it looks like fate. Borchetta was a promotions man at DreamWorks Nashville, a label on the verge of being shuttered as part of a corporate restructuring, and he had been moving quietly toward a dream of his own, an independent label built on a different kind of artist relationship, looser in its controls, longer in its view. He heard Taylor perform at the Bluebird Cafe, that deceptively modest room in Green Hills where Nashville's inner circle routinely discovered its own future, and he saw not just a voice and a face, but a creative intelligence he recognized as rare precisely because it was so unguarded. She was not performing for the industry people in the room. She was performing for the room. Big Machine Records launched in 2005 with Taylor Swift as its foundational artist, and, in a structural sense, its bet the house wager on a theory of music that had not yet been proven, that an artist who maintained genuine intimacy with her audience could build a fanbase that was loyal not to a radio format or a marketing campaign, but to a person. Borchetta gave her something that almost no major label would have considered for an artist of her age and experience: meaningful creative control. She would co-write. She would have input on production. Her voice, not just her vocal instrument but her authorial perspective, would be preserved rather than professionalized. What he did not give her, because he could not yet afford to, was a conventional promotional infrastructure. Big Machine was new. Its relationships with radio were nascent. Its resources were real but finite. And so Taylor Swift went online. In 2005 and 2006, MySpace was the closest thing the early internet had produced to a public square with a soundtrack. It was not elegant. The platform was chaotic by design, its user profiles cluttered with auto-playing music files and rotating GIFs and comment threads that scrolled into infinity. But it was also, for a musician without radio play, a direct channel to listeners unmediated by any institutional filter. Taylor Swift understood this with a clarity that was, depending on one's vantage point, either precocious or simply logical. She had grown up digital. The idea of reaching an audience through a corporation seemed to her not only inefficient, but, in some harder-to-articulate way, dishonest. The fans who mattered, the ones who would become the nucleus of something durable, were not passive. They were searching. And they would find her if she made herself findable. She posted constantly. Not the managed output of a promotional calendar, but the actual texture of her days. The notebook where she drafted lyrics on the tour bus, the small venues where she was learning what it meant to hold a room with nothing but a guitar and a spotlight, the feelings she was metabolizing into songs faster than most adults process them into therapy. When someone commented on a track, she responded. When someone left a message saying a lyric had helped them through something, she wrote back something specific, something that demonstrated she had read what they'd said. The responses were not templated. The attention was not simulated. Girls across the country, and they were overwhelmingly girls in those first years, began to understand that Taylor Swift was not a product they were consuming. She was a person who was aware of them. The fan accounts that began proliferating in 2006 and 2007 had a quality distinct from ordinary celebrity obsession. They felt, to the people running them, reciprocal. The self-titled debut album arrived in October 2006, and it entered the world not with the explosive first-week chart performance that would characterize her later releases, but with something arguably more consequential. It did not leave. It stayed on the Billboard 200 for 275 weeks. It climbed slowly, buoyed by word of mouth and by a fan base that had been cultivated message by message before the album existed. Radio eventually caught up, but the album's commercial arc had already been established by the time radio arrived, which was, for the industry, deeply confusing. Labels had metrics for launch windows and first-week scan counts, and ad rates at country radio. They did not yet have metrics for what Taylor Swift was doing, which was building loyalty at the individual level and watching it aggregate into something that behaved like a movement. She was, in these years, also learning the limits of the machine she was climbing into. Borchetta was a genuine ally, but Big Machine was still a business, and the business had interests that were not always identical to hers. She had creative input, but she did not have creative sovereignty. The masters of her recordings, the ownership of the actual audio files that constituted her work, belonged to the label, as they belonged to nearly every artist in the history of the recording industry. This was standard. This was simply how it was done. No one sat across a conference table from a 14-year-old and explained that she was trading something she might someday want back in exchange for the opportunity she could not afford to refuse. The music industry did not think of itself as extractive in this way. It thought of itself as a collaborative venture, and in many respects it was. But the terms of the collaboration were written by one side. She signed what she was presented with. She was a teenager who wanted, more than anything, to make music that people heard. The alternative to the terms was the alternative to the deal, and the alternative to the deal was silence. Scott Borchetta functions in this chapter not simply as a business partner, but as a mirror. He saw in Taylor Swift an image of his own conviction, that the old model was ending, that the artist-label relationship needed to evolve, that intimacy with the listener was the only sustainable competitive advantage in a world where distribution was becoming frictionless and gatekeeping was becoming optional. He was right about all of it, and his being right about all of it would eventually make the question of who owned the fruits of that conviction the most contested question of Taylor Swift's professional life. In 2006 and 2007, none of that is visible. What is visible is a young woman and an older man who believed in the same thing, working toward it together, getting rich toward it together at different rates and by different mechanisms. The girl on MySpace types back within minutes. She always types back within minutes. Her fans are in Ohio, in Georgia, in the suburbs of cities she has not yet played, in bedrooms very much like hers, except for the guitar propped against the wall, and the notebook full of second verses, and the knowledge, which she carries with her everywhere by now like a stone in the pocket, that something is happening. She can feel it the way a weather system feels its own pressure, from inside, from everywhere at once, without a center and without a ceiling. She has not yet played an arena. She has not yet won a Grammy. She has not yet written Love Story, or You Belong With Me, or any of the songs that will turn her from a country music success story into a genuinely cross-genre cultural phenomenon. All of that is still in front of her, still unmade, still contingent on 1,000 variables she does not control. What she controls is this: the screen, the cursor, the message, the response. The fan who typed "I felt this" now has a reply in her inbox, and the reply is long, and it is specific, and it means something. This is not a strategy, not yet, or rather it is the kind of strategy that does not feel like one from the inside because it is also simply a person's nature made systematic. She is building a constituency before she has built a catalog, and she is doing it not because she calculated that it would work, but because it is what she would have wanted, on the receiving end. And she has the instinct, the almost frightening organizational instinct, to translate what she wants into what she provides. She closes the laptop, eventually. The blue light goes dark under the door. But the thing she has set in motion does not stop moving. And the platform she has learned to trust with the unpolished edges of herself will, in ways neither she nor anyone at Big Machine fully grasps, outlast every contract she has ever signed, except for the ones she hasn't signed yet, the ones still being drafted in offices she has never visited by men who are watching her numbers climb and beginning to understand with something between admiration and alarm that she is not the kind of asset that stays comfortably inside its category. Chapter 19. The Transition to Fearless and Chapman's Production. The first thing Taylor Swift notices is the smell. Nashville in August has a particular weight to it, heat that doesn't move, air so thick with humidity it presses against the skin like a damp cloth. She is 14 years old, standing outside a nondescript building on Music Row with her mother Andrea beside her, a manila folder of demo recordings tucked under her arm, and the city feels enormous in a way that Wyomissing, Pennsylvania never did. Wyomissing had been orderly, predictable, a suburb where the lawns were always trimmed and the future arrived on schedule. Nashville smells like ambition and asphalt and something else she cannot name, something fermenting beneath the surface, like the city itself is in the middle of becoming. She will spend the next 4 years learning to become alongside it. She had already done something remarkable before she arrived. At 13, she had marched into the offices of DreamWorks Records in New York, handed executives a collection of karaoke tapes, and politely informed them that she was going to be a country music star. The executives were courteous. They were not persuaded. The music industry in 2003 absorbed young hopefuls like water absorbs sugar, completely without a trace. What made Taylor different, what Andrea had recognized with the particular clarity of a parent who refuses to confuse wish with perception, was that Taylor wrote her own songs. Not the songs of someone performing a feeling, but the songs of someone trying to metabolize an experience too large for ordinary speech. When most girls her age were keeping diaries, Taylor was keeping melodies. The decision to move the family to Tennessee was Scott Swift's concession to his daughter's certainty. He arranged a job transfer with Merrill Lynch, and the Swifts relocated in 2004, a tactical repositioning dressed as a family adventure. Andrea drove Taylor down Music Row every afternoon that first year, and Taylor knocked on every door that would open. Most didn't. The country music establishment of 2004 was a closed ecosystem, governed by gatekeepers who understood the genre as a product with precise specifications. Grown women singing about trucks and heartache, produced by men who had been doing exactly that for 20 years. A 14-year-old girl from Pennsylvania, with a portfolio of self-written songs, did not fit the specification. She was told, in various registers of professional kindness, to wait. To grow up. To come back when she sounded like something they already knew. She responded to this advice by ignoring it entirely. The country music industry she was attempting to enter was not static. It was in 2004, in the middle of a prolonged identity crisis that nobody was quite willing to name. The format had spent the 1990s riding the Garth Brooks-engineered expansion into mainstream American consciousness, crossover sales numbers that had briefly made Nashville the most commercially potent address in popular music. But by the mid-2000s, the bloom was measurably off. Radio consultants were noting that country's core demographic was aging, that younger listeners were drifting toward pop and hip-hop and the emergent chaos of digital music distribution. The iTunes Store had launched in April 2003, and within 18 months, it was clear that the album as unit of commerce was beginning to fracture. The labels didn't fully understand what this meant yet. They were still operating on the logic of a world where distribution was scarce and access was controlled, not realizing that the 14-year-old girl knocking on their doors came from the first generation that had never experienced music any other way. Scott Borchetta understood this, at least partially. Borchetta was a Music Row veteran, a promoter who had spent years working inside DreamWorks Nashville and had accumulated enough industry knowledge to recognize what the industry was missing. In 2005, he was preparing to launch an independent label he would call Big Machine Records, funded in part by a car dealership magnate named Randy Marion, who had been convinced that the music business was worth a speculative bet. Borchetta was looking for artists who could grow with the label, who were young enough to develop over time and talented enough to justify the patience. When he met Taylor Swift at an industry showcase in the fall of 2005, she performed an original song. He signed her before he had finished building the company. It was, on paper, an improbable arrangement. Big Machine had no infrastructure, no promotional apparatus, no proven track record. Taylor was 15 and had never released a professional recording. What both of them possessed, however, was an unusually accurate read of where the culture was drifting. Borchetta believed that authenticity, or at least the precise simulation of it, was about to become the most valuable commodity in popular music. Taylor didn't think in those terms yet. She just wanted to sing the songs she had written. It turned out those were the same thing. The collision between those two sensibilities happened in a studio, and the person who mediated it was Nathan Chapman. Chapman was 26 when he first met Taylor, working out of a demo studio on Music Row, where songwriters brought rough ideas to be shaped into something presentable. He was not a celebrity producer. He had no platinum plaques, no signature sound that critics had named. What he had was a structural intelligence about music, an ability to hear the architecture inside a rough recording and understand what it was trying to become. Taylor began bringing him her songs almost immediately after signing with Big Machine, and what happened in their sessions together was less production in the conventional sense and more a kind of collaborative translation. Taylor's demos arrived with harmonic instincts already intact. The chord changes were not always sophisticated, but they were always intentional. She had a songwriter's ear for the moment when a progression needs to release tension, when a bridge needs to feel like escape. What she didn't yet have was the technical vocabulary to specify what she wanted from an arrangement. Chapman supplied that vocabulary. He heard banjo where she heard brightness, heard fiddle where she heard ache, heard the way an acoustic guitar could carry emotional weight that an electric could not replicate. They were building a sonic language together, and neither of them initially understood that it would eventually need to speak to two different audiences simultaneously. The core conflict of this period was not Taylor's talent, which was never seriously in doubt once people actually heard her. It was genre. Country radio in 2006 was a format controlled by a narrow set of production conventions, and deviation from those conventions carried commercial risk that most programmers refused to absorb. Taylor's songs had hooks that behaved like pop songs. They arrived early, they repeated insistently, they were built for the kind of repeated listening that streaming would later quantify, but that radio programmers were already intuiting. This was not how traditional country songs were structured. Traditional country songs earned their hooks. They delayed gratification. They asked the listener to follow a narrative before rewarding them with a chorus. Taylor and Chapman threaded this needle with a precision that looked effortless and was not. The debut single, Tim McGraw, released in June 2006, was built around a fiddle line that signaled country to any radio programmer who needed a quick format confirmation. But its structure, the verse pre-chorus chorus architecture, the way the bridge arrived as emotional climax rather than narrative digression, was pure pop. It was a formal sleight of hand, and it worked because the song was genuinely felt. Taylor had written it in a math class, thinking about a boyfriend she would leave behind when the school year ended, and the specific grief of that anticipation was in every syllable. You could hear that it was true. That authenticity was the carrier signal that made the formal experimentation palatable to programmers who might otherwise have noticed the category violation. The self-titled debut album arrived in October 2006 and climbed the Billboard 200 slowly, with a patience that nobody in the modern music industry expected or planned for. It would spend more than 2 years on the chart. This was not a phenomenon that the label fully understood in real time. Big Machine was tracking radio ads and sales figures, watching the album's gradual accumulation of audience, but the mechanism driving that accumulation was not fully visible yet. Fans were finding Taylor through a young internet, MySpace pages, early YouTube uploads, the nascent infrastructure of digital word of mouth, and they were finding her in a way that felt personal, as though they had discovered her rather than been sold her. This distinction mattered enormously to the audience, even if they couldn't have articulated why. What Taylor understood intuitively was that the relationship between an artist and an audience was changing in ways that the traditional industry had not yet priced in. She maintained her own MySpace page, responded to fan messages personally, wrote blog posts that read like entries from a particularly self-aware diary. This was not a calculated social media strategy. The vocabulary didn't exist yet. It was an instinct, the behavior of someone who had been told repeatedly that she didn't belong in this industry and had therefore decided to build her own relationship with the people who mattered most, the listeners. She was bypassing the gatekeepers, not by forcing doors open, but by building a parallel infrastructure that made those doors increasingly irrelevant. The partnership with Chapman deepened as they moved toward the second album. Fearless would begin taking shape in the spring of 2008, and the sessions pushed further into the territory they had been carefully navigating. Chapman brought in more elaborate arrangements, layered acoustic guitars, piano lines that functioned as emotional counterweight to the fiddle, production choices that gave the recordings a fullness that the debut had sometimes lacked. Taylor pushed the hooks harder. The songs on Fearless were not more personal than the debut, but they were more structurally ambitious, built for arenas before there were arena shows to put them in. Love Story took the Romeo and Juliet narrative and inverted its ending with a cheerful absence of literary guilt, setting it over a banjo progression that arrived in your head and refused to leave. You Belong With Me translated adolescent longing into a 3-minute argument so clean and so complete that it felt like a geometric proof. The figure who shadowed this entire period, whose influence moved beneath the surface of every creative decision, was Andrea Swift. She was not a stage mother in the industry's pejorative sense. She was not pushing, not managing, not imposing her own frustrated ambitions onto her daughter's career. She was something more specific and more useful, a clear-eyed interpreter. When Taylor came home from a session uncertain, it was Andrea who asked the right question. When a label executive suggested a creative direction that didn't feel true, it was Andrea who helped Taylor name why. She had built her life around her daughter's certainty, and in return she kept that certainty from curdling into arrogance. The relationship was not without its difficulties. Taylor was, in these years, a teenager with a teenager's furious need for autonomy, and Andreas' proximity to every professional decision created frictions that neither of them fully acknowledged. But Andreas' judgment was almost always right, and Taylor, whatever else she would become, had the wisdom to know it. Nathan Chapman watched the partnership and understood something important about Taylor that would take the larger music industry several more years to absorb. She was not a vessel for other people's visions. She was not, in the way that most label signings were, an artist waiting to be developed. She was already developed in the ways that mattered. What she needed was not guidance toward her sound, but the technical infrastructure to execute what she already knew the sound should be. Chapman provided that infrastructure, and received in return a collaborator who worked with an intensity that he found both challenging and clarifying. She would push back on arrangements that didn't feel emotionally accurate. She would sit with the song for hours past the point where most artists would have moved on, listening for the thing that wasn't yet right. This stubbornness, and it was stubbornness unambiguously, was the mechanism of her quality control. It was also occasionally the thing that made sessions run past midnight and assistants develop a complicated relationship with overtime. Fearless was released in November 2008. It would go on to win the Grammy Award for Album of the Year, making Taylor the youngest artist ever to claim that prize. It would sell more than 12 million copies worldwide. It would confirm everything that the Nashville establishment had spent 4 years politely doubting. None of that was knowable in November 2008, of course. What was knowable was that the album sounded like confidence, not the performed confidence of someone pretending to certainty, but the earned confidence of someone who had spent 4 years in rooms where she wasn't supposed to belong and had refused with extraordinary stubbornness to leave. What nobody in those rooms had thought to ask yet was what would happen when the confidence and the stubbornness turned toward something other than music, when Taylor Swift, having conquered the machinery of a genre, decided she needed to own the machine itself. Chapter 20. Love Story and Global Pop Crossover. The fluorescent lights of a Nashville recording studio have a particular quality that no one ever romanticizes. Flat, slightly greenish, the kind of light that flattens skin and makes coffee look like motor oil. In the autumn of 2008, Taylor Swift sits cross-legged on a studio floor with a spiral notebook balanced on her knee, a pencil moving in tight, urgent circles around a single phrase she has written and crossed out 3 times. The phrase is, "Romeo, save me." She says it aloud to herself, not singing it, just tasting the syllables, and then she writes it again, this time without crossing it out. Around her, the studio hums with the low electrical breath of equipment in standby mode. Scott Borchetta, the founder of Big Machine Records, is somewhere down the hall. Her mother Andrea is reading in the lounge. The engineers are getting coffee. For a few minutes, in that particular flatness of fluorescent light, Taylor Swift is alone with a love story that isn't finished yet. And she knows, with the specific certainty of someone who has been writing songs since she could hold a pencil, that it is about to be. The world Taylor Swift had navigated since arriving in Nashville in 2004 was one of fierce and specific gatekeeping. Country music in the mid-2000s was a genre that understood itself as a covenant between artist and tradition, between the music and its audience, between the steel guitar and the American heartland. It was not a world that readily made room for a 14-year-old girl from Pennsylvania who wore sparkly dresses and had memorized every Shania Twain chord. The industry operated on a logic of patience and dues paying that most artists spent a decade absorbing before anyone took them seriously. And yet something had shifted, quietly and then all at once, in the architecture of the music business itself. The iTunes Store had opened in 2003, and by 2006, the year Taylor's self-titled debut arrived, digital singles were dismantling the old calculus of how a song found its audience. MySpace, ungainly, adolescent, structurally chaotic, had become a genuine platform for direct artist-to-fan connection, and Taylor Swift had understood this before nearly anyone else in her genre. She ran her own pages, replied to her own messages, and spoke to her fans with a directness that felt less like a marketing strategy than a genuine conversational compulsion. She was not performing accessibility. She was simply herself, and the internet, in that particular historical window, was uniquely receptive to that. The core conflict that surrounded the creation and release of Love Story was not primarily about whether the song was good. Everyone in Taylor's orbit knew it was. The conflict was categorical, a quiet but insistent industry argument about what Taylor Swift was allowed to be. Country radio programmers were territorial in ways that had professional logic behind them. Their stations had formats, their formats had listeners, and their listeners had expectations that had been calibrated over decades. A song that sounded the way Love Story sounded, the production bright and surging, the arrangement built around momentum rather than texture, the hooks so wide and immediate it felt almost architectural, was a song that made programmers nervous. It was too pop. The reverb was too clean. The tempo was too confident. What they were really saying, beneath the technical language, was that Taylor Swift was growing in a direction that the genre had not formally approved, and the genre did not love being outpaced by a 19-year-old. Meanwhile, on the pop side, there were those who wondered whether a song about Romeo and Juliet delivered in a country-inflected vocal belonged on their stations at all. Taylor Swift, in the autumn of 2008, was standing at a border that neither side of the music industry was quite ready to dissolve, holding a song that didn't care about the border at all. The specific decision that most clearly illuminates Taylor Swift's character in this period is not the writing of Love Story, it is the rewriting of it. The original Shakespearean tragedy, as Swift conceived it in her bedroom, after returning from a party where she felt the social weight of a disapproving relationship, did not end in rescue. The story of Romeo and Juliet does not end in rescue. Swift knew this. She had read it in school with the careful attention she gave to everything that arrived in language. And yet she made a deliberate, fully conscious choice to take the narrative somewhere Shakespeare had not taken it, to give Juliet the ending the play withholds. This is sometimes read as naivety, as the sentimentality of a teenager who didn't understand the source material. It was precisely the opposite. She understood the source material well enough to know what it was withholding, and she decided that withholding it was a choice, not a necessity. The bridge of Love Story arrives with Romeo on one knee, not dead in a tomb, and Taylor Swift put him there with full authorial deliberation. What this reveals is something essential about her relationship to narrative. She does not submit to the logic of existing stories. She interrogates them, identifies the emotional need they fail to meet, and rewrites the ending to meet it. This is the instinct of a storyteller who believes, at a structural level, that the purpose of a story is to give its audience something to carry forward, not a lesson in tragedy, but an experience of possibility. It would define her artistic choices for the next 15 years. The figure who stands at the center of this particular chapter's supporting architecture is not a romantic partner or a close friend, but Scott Borchetta, whose relationship with Taylor Swift during this period was one of the more consequential creative partnerships in early 21st century American music. Borchetta had signed Taylor when she was 13, on the basis of a belief in her songwriting that was, at that point, an act of genuine faith rather than market calculation. By the time Love Story was in production, the relationship had evolved into something more complex, a collaboration between a label founder who understood the country music infrastructure intimately and an artist who was beginning to move faster than that infrastructure could comfortably track. Borchetta had founded Big Machine Records in 2005 with the specific intention of building something more agile than the major label system. And in Taylor Swift, he had an artist whose instincts were themselves agile, constantly adjusting, never quite where you expected her to be. What solidified between them around Fearless, the album that Love Story would anchor, was a shared conviction that the song could do something unprecedented. It could work simultaneously as a country record and as something else, something wider, without sacrificing either identity. Borchetta pushed the single to pop radio with the same force he pushed it to country stations, a move that was not standard practice and was considered by many in Nashville to be either visionary or reckless, depending on who you asked. The gamble would pay off in a way that neither of them could have fully projected, and it would also plant the first seeds of a tension that the partnership would eventually be unable to contain. Love Story was released as the lead single from Fearless in September 2008, and what happened next had the shape, in retrospect, of an inevitability that was not inevitable at all. The song entered the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart and climbed with the steady velocity of something engineered for altitude. But it did not stop at country. It crossed over to the Billboard Hot 100 with a momentum that surprised even those who had been predicting crossover potential, peaking inside the top 5 and holding there with the kind of chart longevity that radio programmers track with a mixture of admiration and unease. Internationally, the song traveled in ways that country music, which was still largely an American and Australian phenomenon at this point, rarely traveled. It reached the top 10 in Australia, Canada, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. It performed on European charts that had almost no infrastructure for the genre it had arrived from. What this meant, in practical terms, was that a 19-year-old from Wyomissing, Pennsylvania, who had been told implicitly and sometimes explicitly that she was too young, too pop, too something for the country music establishment, had written a song about a Shakespearean tragedy with a revised ending and taken it to an audience that did not know or care what genre it belonged to. The audience had simply recognized something in it, an emotional directness, a yearning that was specific enough to feel personal and universal enough to feel shared, and had claimed it. The production of Love Story, handled primarily by Nathan Chapman, who had been working with Taylor since her debut, made choices that deserve attention because they are often underexamined in accounts of the song's success. The arrangement builds from a relatively spare opening, acoustic guitar, a gentle pickup, into a sweeping, almost cinematic chorus in which the production expands to fill every available frequency with a sense of propulsion. The key is D major, a key associated in music theory with something open and declarative, and the tempo is brisk enough that the song always feels like it is moving towards something rather than settling into anything. The strings that arrive in the final chorus are not decorative, they are structural, designed to give the emotional resolution of the bridge, the proposal, the happy ending, a weight that the lyric alone might not quite carry. Chapman and Swift understood that the literary source material required the production to do emotional work that the text was gesturing at rather than spelling out. The result was a 3-minute 56-second argument made entirely in the language of melody and arrangement, that a pop song could carry literary ambition without becoming heavy, that sentiment did not require simplicity, and that an audience in 2008 was hungry for something that trusted them to feel more than one thing at once. What the international success of Love Story also exposed, though this would only become clear in the years following, was the degree to which Taylor Swift's artistic identity had become genuinely difficult to contain within a single genre's commercial logic. The song was winning Country Music Association awards and appearing on European pop charts in the same season. It was being played at high school dances and dissected by music critics who didn't typically write about country radio. This multiplicity was, commercially, an extraordinary asset. It meant Taylor Swift could access audiences that most of her Nashville contemporaries could not reach. But it also meant that the category of country artist, which carried with it a set of aesthetic expectations, a specific relationship with a specific audience, a particular set of industry relationships and loyalties, was beginning to fit her the way a coat fits someone who is still growing. She could wear it. She filled it well, in many places. But the seams by late 2008 were already showing the faint stress of someone who had not yet reached her full size. In photographs from this period, Taylor Swift looks like what she is, a teenager who has just had an enormous thing happen to her and is still in the process of understanding it. The smile is genuine, but there is something behind the eyes that is not quite surprise. It is more like recognition, the expression of someone who suspected something was possible and has just received confirmation. She is holding a Grammy that hasn't happened yet, in a manner of speaking. She is standing at the beginning of something that will expand beyond any frame she currently has to put around it. The notebook with "Romeo Save Me" written in pencil is already closed, already in the past. The song is out in the world now, doing the work that songs do when they find the right moment. It is becoming someone else's story, thousands of times over, in languages Taylor Swift does not speak, in countries she has not yet visited, in the rooms of people who will never know that she wrote it on a bedroom floor after a party where she felt out of place. What no one in Nashville fully reckoned with in the autumn of 2008, not Borchetta, not the radio programmers, not the industry analysts mapping chart trajectories, was that the audience love story had just introduced to Taylor Swift was not going to wait for the genre to decide what she was. That audience was going to make its own decision, and it was going to make it at a scale that would eventually require Taylor Swift to make a decision too, one that would cost her something she had spent years building, and would cost others something they had not yet realized they were holding.